Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm Robert Colvile, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm delighted to be joined today by James Ball, who is Global Editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, a Pulitzer Prize winner and astonishingly prolific journalist and author. While James and I disagree on some, if not a lot of political issues,
quite a few
behind me, we are both sort of share a fascination with that strange bundle of tubes and wires called the internet, which has transformed all of our lives in quite sort of extraordinary ways over recent years. And James's new book, The System, I don't have a copy here, otherwise I would show it to you, is an exploration. Perfect. Is, as he says, effectively the unauthorized biography of the internet. So it's sort of pointing out that that below the Facebooks and Amazons and Apples and Googles is a whole network of rules and devices and institutions, which has exerted a profound influence on how we experience the internet, how we experience the world, really. So we're going to talk for about half an hour, then I will hand over to questions. If you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A box, and please do feel free to do so. Otherwise, James and I will probably just end up talking about his cats, who may make a cameo appearance. So with that, let's start with a pretty easy question. James, the system. What is it? What's your central argument in the book?
It's essentially that most of the time that we talk about the internet, we're talking about the same 4 or 5 companies, you know, a couple of monopolies, or the problems with social networking, or is Google too dominant in search? And we talk about these companies as if they are the internet, and we forget the kind of utility style public service behind it. If we do ever sort of stop to think about it, we tend to think about quite utopian language. You know, we think of our photos and our sort of data being in the cloud, rather than, you know, in a data center off somewhere where land is cheap, you know, maybe in sort of rural Ireland or somewhere. We've sort of abstracted the sort of idea of the internet and the network so far that it's become invisible in our lives. It's like turning a tap on. And instead, it's this sort of network of sort of hosepipe thick cables, you know, the transatlantic internet cables. If you're imagining something like this, they're the size of a hosepipe, and fishing nets hook them up and break them. You've got this kind of physical infrastructure that's fragile and invisible, and then this whole network of rules that were based on sort of when the internet had 100 computers on it, or 1,000 or 10,000, and people could ring each other up if someone was messing around on it. And this thing that grew up as this slightly idealistic research system, this sort of US Department of Defense funded project to try and check how you could send data in more resilient ways, suddenly has become critical infrastructure. And that has loads of implications on our lives. The sort of architecture of the internet, the protocols at its core, the layers and the foundations that everything else is built on, they're not really made for a world where 4 billion of us are on the internet and it's vital, critical infrastructure. But we also didn't really think about what the effect of decisions that would be made early on are. There's nothing built into the core of the internet to track your identity or who's using it. And so this got built in really late on by a workaround. Sort of, you might have heard of cookies or trackers. It's how you stay logged in. It's how adverts follow you around. But that decision made a long time ago on quite sort of low thinking has shaped how data is collected from us and why we have so little control of it. And lots of other little decisions that were made when the internet was small and not important have turned it into this behemoth that operates in certain ways. And so part of my argument is we have to start taking the internet seriously and looking below the surface of it at the bits that we thought were boring and technical and could be left to the nerds. Because the last boring and technical thing we were told we could leave to the nerds was sort of financial products and the sort of magic coming up to that crash. And we had good cause to regret that later. But we also need to think about how the architecture of the internet, it being a network, it getting rid of physical space, also makes monopolies, also creates huge data empires, and wonder whether that works for us. You know, if we just tackle Facebook and then tackle Google and then tackle the next thing, we'll play whack-a-mole. Why does the internet keep making monopolies? And what can we do? And what should we do? How far should we go to stop it doing that? And it's not trying to be a book saying we should just pull the plug and all go back to high streets and flat caps and whippets. It's a book trying to go, the internet can be a really good thing. It just needs to work for all of us rather than for a really small slice of us.
And I think that's, I mean, one of the interesting things about the book is the way you don't kind of, as you say, you don't sort of fall down on one particular ideological divide. I mean, I've sort of lost count of the number of books I've read which have talked about sort of reimagining the internet in a way which has made it very clear that, you know, you're starting from a place in the author's head. And a few sort of political philosophy books they read by Karl Marx or others, and then rather than dealing with this network as it is, but the internet's always attracted sort of utopian thinking, hasn't it? I mean, even in the famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, this even if it's not entirely true, because as you said, DARPA was very fundamentally involved in it. There was this idea it was kind of created by freaks and geeks and weirdos to be a space outside of outside of the law, outside of normal existence.
So John Perry Barlow actually wrote that Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace kind of in the 90s, and I think he probably picked his phrasing quite carefully. He's sadly no longer with us. But the Declaration of Independence, when it was made for the US, it was hardly a sort of statement of fact or of how the world was at the time it was written. It was a sort of statement of intent, of direction. And even in the 90s, where the online declaration was written, I think John Perry Barlow knew it wasn't true. It's just he was trying to set out what it could be. But the internet sort of as a network is just a boring thing of sending data from here to there and then letting your computer decide what to do with it. Had a fairly revolutionary idea at its heart, in that, we're talking about 1969 when this sort of first connections were made. And at that time, on most phone networks, if you wanted to plug in an answering machine, you would pay more. You would pay more, of course, for a long distance call than a short call. Everything on the network was treated differently, and the network cared a great deal what you were doing. The internet's sort of core principle is that it will take your data, put it in little envelopes called packets, and get those to where you want them to go. And so a packet is a packet is a packet. It doesn't care whether it's data, whether it's a live call, whether it's audio, whether it's an email. It can be anything and it will be treated the same. And that was a really revolutionary idea and seems to be quite an egalitarian one. And then sort of through it, we've had these optimistic things. The internet is a global network. It works by one set of standards. It works by one set of rules. It doesn't cost you any more to Zoom with someone next door compared to across the other side of the world. That sentence was the wrong way around, but we'll go past that. And so that was quite a utopian idea. We thought that retail would be revolutionized by the internet in that, you'd have the long tail. It would help small artists. It would help small publishers because you didn't have limits of shelf space. Some of those utopian ideas have been built up and been correct, but others, if we'd have thought a bit more carefully, we could have seen how it would go. We could see that network effects would create monopoly winners. We could have seen some of it coming, but it went so quickly from something that no one used and no one needed to care about to something that everyone was on, and why talk about it? It's just the internet, isn't it? We never really had that middle bit where it was a good size to fix. And I think you're right. A lot of people dodge the hard bit of the problem by going, if we were building an internet from scratch now, what would it look like? It's like, I mean, pretty empty because no one would move to it, mate. What we have to do with the internet now is pretty much like rebuilding a spaceship while you're sort of a few light years in orbit. But just because it's a hard task doesn't mean you'll do better just to ignore it.
What would you say would, like, if you were sort of listing sort of 3 or 4 or 5 like potential points of failure or concern within this network? I mean, what would they be? I mean, are you more worried about, you know, like in the short term about specific points of technical failure, or just about a sort of bigger sort of, you know, the fact that the decisions are made by the wrong people in the wrong ways?
I think some of the technical and the political failures of the internet interact with each other. The big one that lots of people worry about and have worried about for a long time is the breakup of the internet. It's the idea that, you know, as conflicts between the US and China escalate...
Splinternet, as they call it.
Yeah, the splinternet, or they used to call it the balkanized internet, but splinternet's cuter. But basically, for a bunch of reasons that can tie to some of the next ones, countries start going, actually, screw it. We want to be able to have more control over how data flows. We want to be able to sort of change how these protocols work and interact with each other. And we're just going to change them for our country. And anyone who wants to network with us can follow our protocols and screw the rest of you. And so you could end up with a sort of Chinese sphere of internet, a US sphere of internet, a European one, and you lose all of the benefits of it being a global communication network where everything speaks to everything natively. At the moment, it would be, you can email absolutely anyone, no matter whether they're using Gmail, Yahoo, whether they still use Outlook. Everything talks to everything. It's an open standard. It's an open internet. You know, splintering the internet would be more like, at the moment, trying to send a Facebook message to someone on Signal. You know, they just don't speak to each other. They don't talk.
Yeah, and of course, the internet is splintering in some ways between different companies. Like, and one of the trends in recent, you know, that there's a massive argument currently going on, for example, over the App Store, where Apple is, you know, like big companies are understandably for commercial reasons tending to think, you know, if we, you know, having people communicate with other people outside of our walled garden, or, you know, even worse, pay money to people that we could be getting a slice of outside our walled garden, is not an ideal thing to happen.
Exactly. So you've got the prospect of it splintering geographically, and you've got the prospect of the open internet becoming basically empty and unused because each corporate traps you within its walled garden.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, that traps is a, you know, it, you know, in a consumer sense, what they are doing is good for us. You know, there is nothing compelling us to use Facebook or an iPhone or, you know, whatever other, or TikTok or whatever other service it may be. They are, you know, they are just so very superior to their rivals and have such a kind of value, have created such a value and such a sort of depth of data, data to, you know.
There's a little of that, but there's also, if they were making it interoperable, you could pick which service you wanted for which things. You might really like using Google Docs, but be able to want to use it with a different email provider and then use it with WhatsApp. You might want your emails on Hotmail, your video on something else. If they all speak to each other on an open internet, you've got more consumer choice. You can tailor it. You can make those decisions. And they are competing not just on who can trap you in their ecosystem first, but which of their individual services is better. You know, yes, consumer choice means you can pick which ecosystem you get trapped in, but at the moment you don't have as much choice as you would if we had open standards. But we've got sort of other fears to the internet. You've got this fragmentation of it, but you've also just got that lots of the systems sort of behind the curtain that make the internet work, you've probably not heard of, that are quite vulnerable. And so there's one called BGP, which is short for Border Gateway Protocol, which basically just decides which physical cables your internet traffic goes down, you know, which routers does it stop off at in between to get to its destination? It's a bit of a simplification, but it'll do. So I will knock that call off. It's a bit of a simplification, but it does the job. Now, this was set up in the 1980s by two engineers who knew the way that traffic was flowing at the time wasn't working very well. And they met at in the canteen of a tech conference and kind of said, we need something, we need a stopgap to fix this. Went, look, obviously we can't come up with a long-term solution now, and they sketched something on the back of 2 or 3 napkins that is now still in use 30 years later, with the internet 10,000, 100,000 times bigger than it was. Now this BGP is completely insecure, and big internet providers, and of course a lot of big internet providers are controlled by countries, can use this to redirect traffic. And so you've had incidents where suddenly an internet provider in Pakistan has accidentally taken out YouTube for most of the world because they made a mistake trying to censor one video. You've got a time where, apparently by an online accident, a whole bunch of traffic heading towards Gmail still got there, but routed its way through China first, sort of entering and leaving China, which ostensibly could then be saving the data, collecting it. So you've got fundamental security vulnerabilities built into the fact that the internet's sort of grown up at this speed. So you've got a risk of the internet shattering, the risk that the infrastructure behind it was not built for it to be the critical network we see today. And then the risk of what it does in creating monopolies, and meaning that all of the surplus generated by the internet goes to a very narrow percentage of society. And so you've got a collection of risks that are caused by this interaction of the political and the technical. And people like to pretend you can deal with the political or the technical, because most of us understand at best one of them. You know, I think most of us probably actually understand neither.
I think that's probably fair. I'm just going to be very, very high tech and share my screen for a moment, because a few days ago I saw this on XKCD, which is, I think, sums up your point rather well.
Yes, this is an absolutely brilliant XKCD, and you should think of the bits at the top being, you know, all of the internet services that you like. You know, that's your Facebooks, that's your Amazon, that's your favorite online game. And yeah, that little bit at the bottom, and we've seen bits of those break. Some of them are sort of little volunteer services kept up by 2 or 3 people that then sort of suddenly collapse and fail, and just take out huge swathes of the web or of app services or all sorts. We've got some quite shaky foundations here.
Yeah, I mean, there was a not as damaging example, but there was a fascinating thing I was reading just the other day on how essentially Breitbart, the US site, was just able to like tell advertising networks that, yeah, this traffic came to us, so you should give us some money. Good.
So yes, well, online advertising is its whole own problem, to the extent where sort of the way the book works, I've tried not to just sit in my armchair and do a big think. I've gone out to, you know, someone who helped build the internet, who was there when it was very first designed. You know, the strange thing about the internet is it's only 50 years old, and most of the actual execution was left to undergrad or postgrad students, because it wasn't, you know, it was a sideshow. It wasn't the most important thing in town. And so most of them are alive. So, you know, spoke to them, spoke to the venture capitalists who fund it, spoke to people who used to regulate it, you know, the chief exec of the person in charge of web names. And one of the guys I tracked down was one of the people involved in inventing internet adverts, which I suspect would be quite a good villain for a lot of people. And the way they track and go around, they hide in so much very questionable behavior and complexity. And there's essentially, there's brands who are trying to advertise at one end. There's websites who desperately want some money to fund their operation, you know, like most of the outlets I write for, at another. And then this immensely, unbelievably technical and complex black box in the middle. that leaves both sides with a huge suspicion that they're being ripped off. Now, when you look at the fact that the biggest online ad companies actually now are Google, Facebook, and Amazon, but they make tens of billions in profits a year from it, I think we can probably say, even at a short thing, both sides are right to be suspicious.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also the advertising infrastructure was bolted onto the internet quite late in the day, and you get these extraordinary moments where, say, Facebook will suddenly kind of reveal that actually, when it said that people were engaged with its videos for 100 billion hours, what it meant was 60 billion hours, or that there are sort of. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about in particular, because it came up when we were talking before this. And it's obviously a topic which is really in the news at the moment, is China. So you talked about the splinternet element, but one of the things your book makes clear is how clever and patient China has been in a similar way that you could almost say to the way that China sort of supported the WHO, the World Health Organization, and kind of made sure that it was paying its dues in a way that America wasn't, made sure that it was putting people forward for jobs in those kind of organizations. It's done the same in the internet. Well, and this isn't a kind of a sinister thing. It's a perfectly sort of rational thing for a nation state to do in its own interests. But I was struck by like the one of the concluding lines of your books is essentially like the future of the internet is going to be shaped by the Chinese. Which is
yes, and by other non-democratic states. Essentially, the US had a huge soft power advantage through its dominance of the internet. It dominated most of the institutions that governed it, even the ones that weren't official. It had a surveillance advantage. The pattern of the underseas cables even suits it. It's got most of the companies. Now, if you're not a traditional US ally, you would look at that and think, we need to build up some influence in this area. We need to get some of our own tech companies. We need to try and be a counterweight. I think those particular efforts are absolutely legitimate. They also had the case to make that the US, when it had dominance, didn't set out sort of moral norms or moral principles, and in fact sort of tried to do the idealistic, you should get on the internet, it's wonderful, information at your fingertips, and then also used it to surveil the hell out of the world in any way they wanted. Now, what we're seeing now is China's getting its own sort of unicorns and decacorns, huge companies. They're now wanting to operate outside of China. And the US, whose tech companies operate in every country around the world pretty much, is now having to try and go, well, do you really want to let a company totally controlled by a foreign country, have so much data and so much power, without necessarily realizing people will come to ask the same of them? But China's also playing a clever game by getting into all the standards agencies and sometimes offering its own standards. But where Western governments kind of lack the technical know-how or the political will to sort of fight for high standards, high privacy, high sort of openness for security, China and sort of other sort of more autocratic governments are stepping in, setting up intergovernmental boards to negotiate some protocols. They're getting more and more seats on the governing bodies. And so quite soon we could see that the US primarily, but other Western governments, and maybe even some of the big Western tech giants, have been a bit asleep at the wheel and suddenly find they're no longer in the driving seat. And so there's a tipping point coming up where the US may not be the dominant sort of power on the internet.
Yeah, because I mean, for example, ICANN, which is one of the organizations like that, they used to just be American. They weren't even global organizations, and until surprisingly recently, they were just American. But they did stuff for the rest of the world as well.
So ICANN is basically in charge of deciding who can have a .com, who can have a .org, and also just looking after the system. That means that when you type in google.com, what IP address, what internet address, which is like a sequence of numbers, 194.12.68.12 type thing, which matches to what.
And if you type those numbers in, you get a special prize, by the way. You get a free copy. If you type those numbers in, you get a free copy of James' book.
It'd be a great Easter egg if it was. So, if anyone tries it, tweet me. Sorry if it takes you to some secure network or something and you get arrested. But these things sort of sound quite techy and quite boring, and in some ways are. But you can hijack DNS. You could sort of go, hey, actually, google.com points to me if you're Facebook. You can do all sorts of tricky things. Imagine if you mess with the web addresses for, say, just a slice of the UK for half a day and tell them that hsbc.com points to you. And you've got a site that looks just like HSBC and you harvest their login details. You could do a lot of harm. So that matters. But there's also
that weird episode. I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but there was that weird episode a couple of weeks ago where some guys managed to hack the Twitter accounts of like a good chunk of the world's most important people and used it to make like 10 grand in Bitcoin or something.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have started World War III. You could have crashed the financial markets.
Oh yeah, that's what getting lucky looks like. We really got away with that. But it's a good reminder of even quite basic flaws now. The internet is so crucial. We can do a lot of harm with it.
And again, that turns out to come from just like a decision someone made when Twitter was, was a 2-person company or a 3.
Yeah, they just decided to give a lot of admin tools so that lots of people could just step in and fix stuff, which turned out to have consequences. But on the ICANN stuff, they're also in charge of quite political decisions. So I have 2 cats within sort of 3 feet of me right now. I couldn't get a domain that ended in .cat because that's restricted to the Catalan region of Spain. And so someone had to decide who can have that. Who can have .amazon? Should it be countries along the river? Should it be countries with the rainforest? Or as it is now, should it be the company that controls it? And so you've got loads of really charged, strange decisions that have to be made. And ICANN was, until halfway through Obama's presidency, technically part of the US Department of Commerce. It's still based on the, just out of California. Well, California, it's in Los Angeles actually, but it's a little not-for-profit. Its board is US based, and it's got all these international sort of bodies it consults with. But they're the people. This little not-for-profit on the west coast of the US is in charge of this absolutely fundamental central system to the internet. And that's basically because we can't find anyone else that we think could do it better yet.
And the same for the guys who decide what emojis we get and how representative they are. An increasingly important topic in the modern world.
So yes, and there's sort of Middle Eastern royal families who get to have a say on that as well. It's a little Unicode committee. But what's worrying about the internet is that some of the same people who make these quite light decisions make the very heavy ones. But it's increasingly fragmented who's in charge of what.
I mean, one of
the protocols no one's in charge of.
So one of my pet peeves in the UK is that we just don't take digital seriously in government. I mean, the example I use is the fact that, digital, well, it's now, DCMS is now digital and CMS, but we're essentially sending the same person to incredibly high-level meetings about how the internet works, who we're also putting in charge of Opera.
Well, one of the most extraordinary moments of the Russia report that the sort of Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee put out recently was when everyone was arguing about online electoral interference and electoral misinformation. And the committee kind of wrote to to MI6, who kind of went, well, no, that's not really one for us. MI5 went, no, it's not us. GCHQ sort of went, no, it's one of the others. So they wrote to all 3 intelligence agencies and went, this is, protecting the integrity of elections, the cornerstone of democracy, the reason that you exist. And they wrote back with a kind of joint statement going, actually, we think DCMS is in charge of this. And DCMS sort of had to write back this completely confused thing going, we do the tennis. we do the theatre. Why do you think we are more qualified than you intelligence agencies to do this? And I sort of felt really sorry for DCMS for possibly the first time in a while then.
So I think we're probably going to have to open it up to questions soon. And please do just ask and ask and ask. My sort of final thing is, like, so what would you, and again, so I'm basically just asking you to recap your book, so it's an easy question. What changes would you, like, if you were God Emperor of the internet for a day, apart from like eliminating quite a lot of Twitter, what changes would you make, or do you think can be made in a kind of in a realistic universe to make things work better?
I tend to lay on the side of, we need to do lots of little things. I would like to see us...
You're an Edmund Burke of the internet, rather than...
I'd like to see us put money into making sure the architecture works, making sure the pipe works there, keeping us safe on that. I would like to make us actually get control of our data, not to have a bunch of regulations that mean every website you go to, you have to click 16 things saying you consent, but actually you can take your data with you, you can move with it. The internet works for you, your data works for you, rather than being sort of sucked up and commodified by other people. That could even come to include a revenue share. If data is the new oil, why are we only letting the oil barons get any benefit from it? I think we can share the proceeds there. I think we should.
Although the argument there is that, unlike oil, the data, your individual data is much less valuable than once it is aggregated and refined, and
yes, but
things are done to it.
Oil is worth very little until it's aggregated, extracted, and refined, and yet we still reward the people where it's found, don't we? We don't go, actually, the real value is created by the people who dig it out of the ground, and so. I think there's space for a revenue share, but certainly for actual control of it and understanding of it as a new resource. I think we have to look at, how do we stop a sort of relentless cyber war happening around us by governments? How do they actually come up with a law of armed combat for the internet? And what we really need is a business model that isn't this sort of absolutely manic sort of sequence of venture capital. In the real world, if you want to go and start a business, you can. You can start a restaurant in your town, make a nice restaurant, and if it goes well, you can make a living, you employ a few people, it's nice, it's good, and you might think, I'll buy a second site. You might start to get ambitious and go, I'm going to have 10, I'm going to have this. If you want to build an online business, you've essentially got to go and say, I am going to be bigger than McDonald's within 5 years, or you're going to be nothing. The business model of the internet is just so caught up in this go huge or go home. And so, until we actually start getting other business models online, until you can have the equivalent of a small restaurant, we're going to see this cycle of, growth at all costs, algorithmic attention keeping, all of that. And so, we need new business models online. We need to get off this monoculture of VC.
Well, given you've plugged your book, I should remind people that The Great Acceleration by Robert Colvile, which talks about all these issues, is available from at an extremely cheap price at this point from all good bookshops, including Amazon. But let's move on to to letting other people have a say, and we have 3 questions already. So the first one is to Chris Russell, which is how vulnerable is the internet to a virtual pandemic? To a significant part of world communications or indeed transactions becoming frozen?
Very vulnerable. I mean, one of the sort of warning shots that we had on that was something like WannaCry, which was this sort of cobbled together bit of malware that crippled quite a large swathe of the NHS. And the thing with WannaCry was it seemed to be a very, very effective bit of code to transmit, malware, tied to then a really, really damaging but sort of pointless payload. Much, it wouldn't work for a criminal. It wouldn't work for someone harvesting data. It just
it's kind of like that Twitter hack. It was something which had the potential to be, to be incredible, and then it was actually,
Well, we were sort of lucky, basically. It was basically like something with the infection rate of coronavirus suddenly being spliced to something as deadly as Ebola. I mean, it really took out the computers it hit. It sort of seemed to originate either in Ukraine or Russia, and then spread down to Telefonica, I think it was, in Spain. And then because they administered part of the NHS back end, it hit the NHS seemingly by accident. And then a pretty young security researcher, an ex-hacker, found a kill switch that had just been accidentally left in the code, basically managed to register the domain and took it out for 24 hours. Now, if that had been a test shot of some more serious malware, if a government wanted to suddenly use BGP or use malware or use some of these exploits, we are very, very open to those and vulnerable to those. There are backups and fallbacks, but we have seen large chunks of the internet fall over. And, there's some quite serious-minded security people who will sort of talk about, in trying to get us to worry about this, they will use the phrase cyber nuke, which I'm not sure I'd endorse, but they think are a very real possibility.
And one of the issues that comes across there as well is, and you famously rose to prominence as a kind of WikiLeaks activist, and so you had fun adventures with Julian Assange. But the balance, effectively, nation states are hoarding ways to break the internet, or ways to do very nasty things to the internet, and security agencies. And when the US took down the Iranian nuclear program, suddenly this incredibly sophisticated code was deployed, which was just very, very clearly this virus had been built by a nation state at extremely sophisticated expense. And there is an ongoing debate as to whether it is better and safer for the planet for governments to have these kind of nuclear stockpiles, or for them to sort of unilaterally disarm and tell and sort of tell people these holes exist.
Because essentially, yes, when they find one of these vulnerabilities, that means they could fix it. And so by instead stocking it to use as a weapon, they're basically doing this thing of, we won't build a defense for any of our own population so that we can attack others. And the worrying thing about WannaCry is it was actually the transmission part, the bit that made it spread so well, was an exploit that had been discovered by the US's NSA, National Security Agency, which had then been hacked itself and posted online. And so that was literally them losing control of a kind of weapon of online mass destruction. It did billions in damage. And so they are making these stockpiles, and they are getting lost.
So John Bullard wants to ask about China and blockchain. Those are the two things which come up in everything. But what potential does that kind of technology have to sort of to improve the architecture of the internet, particularly to sort of restore trust that we are all who we say we are, and transactions are generally kosher.
I mean, the issue generally is that for almost anything where you could deploy blockchain, there are simpler means to ensure trust that use much less computational power and are quicker and more efficient. And so often, the thing that most experts tell me once you start getting to any particular use is it's slightly a solution in search of a problem. One of the things that we are relatively good at on the internet now is setting up end-to-end encryption, is verifying identity. Does it have no role to play in that? I would be stupid to dismiss it completely out of hand, and I wouldn't do that. I would say at the moment, it doesn't really seem to solve any it's not the best solution to any of the specific problems that we face. It doesn't mean it's not worth researching and exploring, though.
Yeah. Yes, and just sort of just while I think about it, you mentioned encryption. Obviously, there is among the many sort of science fiction things that we all worry about at night is the idea that quantum computing will render encryption useless at a stroke.
And it would, if it comes in, the whole principle of encryption unravels, and we will have to find a whole new way to be secure online.
Which isn't just
not imminent.
It isn't just about people not reading our emails. It's about like any transaction becomes impossible.
Yes, it's essentially, we can only send card details and credit information and medical information and you name it, can only flow securely across the internet. Anytime you send a signal on the internet, you're basically sending it through a whole bunch of other people's computers that you don't know and you don't see. And so the way that we can trust letting it bounce around all those unknown people is that it's gobbledygook until it reaches the other side. Obviously, without that, they can harvest up rather a lot. Which is a large part of how GCHQ did sort of tempora and mass surveillance, and the NSA ran some of its programs, which was part of why encryption spread more rapidly.
Although, and similarly, you mentioned cookies earlier. I don't know about how accurate this is, but there was an analysis which everyone was actually really quite worried about cookies when they came in, and then 9/11 happened, and suddenly everyone just stopped worrying. The governments stopped worrying, and politicians stopped worrying about online privacy compared with being able to work out what people were up to.
So these things tend to do sort of swings and roundabouts, but I think the question with online mass surveillance has always been, we haven't ever really had good explanations in it working well. It seems to be one of those that when sort of senior spies or ministers know that so much information is flowing around, they want to be able to get at it. But the US, sort of the then head of the NSA, General Alexander, when he was asked to defend a tens of billions of dollar US mass surveillance program, told Congress it had foiled 50 plots. And then they had to revise it down. The next day, they revised it down to 8. And when journalists went, well, what 8? They went, well, we can only give you details of 2, actually. And then they only actually disclosed details of 1. And it was someone who'd sent $9,000 to Al-Shabaab, the sort of terror group in Somalia. And if you're spending tens of billions of dollars and your only public result for that is stopping a $9,000 transaction, I start to wonder whether we're just safer going back to old school targeted human-based surveillance. And the thing that worries me, knowing how much we spend on bulk surveillance type programs in the UK, is the thing you always hear after terror attacks is that they were known to intelligence services, but they'd been taken off the close surveillance lists. And it makes me wonder, because it's their online surveillance sort of theory, moving resources away from where they'd be better deployed? It's an open question, and there's people who would agree and people who would violently disagree. But I think I think there's a little bit too much of, but we should be able to read it.
Changing subjects almost completely, from Bilal, asks, is there a way forward without breaking up the huge tech monopolies? Was a bit of a loaded question. Google, Amazon, etc. And what incentives the government have to undertake these breakups? I just chime in here that one obvious problem with the breakup thesis is that these companies are really quite popular, and quite trusted. Consumers really like what they do.
They're less popular and trusted than they used to be. The principle comes that to break up a company under US law, you need to be able to demonstrate that consumers are paying more for a product than they should, that it's sort of overcharging because it's a monopoly. Now, for Google or Facebook, who don't charge you for their services, that's immense. That's basically impossible to prove. And because the grounds are so narrow for what you can do with antitrust, it means it's basically useless as a weapon in this war. The EU has slightly wider criteria for how it can order breakup, but again has to prove that for whatever situation it's trying to do, breaking up the company is the only thing that could accomplish it. And neither has ever managed to break up a tech giant in this way. And so you're left with, for whatever you would try to solve, I agree, Bilal, that we pay with our data, but that doesn't count as a cash payment under the US competition law. So for whatever we were trying to do, we would have to do a big law change anyway. And you'd have to have supermajority in the Senate, you'd have to have the House, you'd have to do something big. At which point, why be so unambitious that we stick to breaking up Facebook? You know, we could break up Facebook into Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook tomorrow, and it would still be 3 huge tech giants with sprawling power. So if we're trying to solve who controls and monetizes data, if we're trying to solve that you're locked into networks, if we're trying to not just whack down one company so another comes, or if we're trying to make them pay tax, I'd rather see us fight those discrete battles than particularly try and chop apart the tech giants. Because we need the law change anyway, I don't want people wasting their time trying to break them up under US or EU competition law, because in a way, that's the fight that the tech giants would like to have, because it's on their turf and they're most likely to win.
So the company that I admire most at the moment, I feel the sort of sneakiest sense of admiration for, and please do send some more questions in, by the way, otherwise James and I are just going to busk for the last 10 minutes. But the company is Microsoft, because it is now bigger than it's ever been. It's more profitable than it's ever been. It's briefly been the most valuable company in the world. Yet when they summon all these TV CEOs to be sort of grilled on Capitol Hill, they don't invite Microsoft because you don't think of it as a kind of, it doesn't have that. It's not as consumer facing. It's kind of basically it's a sort of office and services company which operates across multiple platforms.
Yeah, they've sort of managed to turn into a business-to-business company, which means they can rake it in hand over fist.
Business-to-business plus Xboxes.
Yes. And everyone likes their game console. A little bit like Apple, if it didn't have the App Store, would probably be quite popular. It does turn out if you don't have a consumer-facing wing, it's fine. I mean, they're also quite lucky that LinkedIn is really boring. Not many people think of LinkedIn when they think of harassment or misinformation or any of that. It's got bits of all of them. But because they've got the kind of boring, professional, sensible social network, they don't get it. It does make me wonder why on earth they would want to buy TikTok. Because it seems to me like just wading right back into all of those congressional wars and all of those parts. So if I was Microsoft, I'd be staying the heck away from it. But, I quite like the idea of them merging LinkedIn and TikTok, just because I think it would be really funny.
God Almighty! I'm just trying to imagine. I mean, I think TikTok. I've reached my limit. I just about partly because I knew some young people. I just about got into. Twitter. Twitter. I could do like Vine. I sort of understood what was happening on it, but TikTok. I just feel just carry on the culture without me.
So TikTok is apparently the one with the most unnerving algorithm, because it's barely based on showing you things from people you follow. It just gets unnervingly good at knowing the specific niche content that you will really like and consume hours of. It's apparently done, people have sort of reverse engineered it. It's when it shows you, it starts by showing you quite general stuff and then finds the sort of unlikeliest of them that you like, and finds the sort of quirkiest likes that you have. It's a clever little sift that it gets through, but it means you can use it for 2 or 3 days, not do much in the way of following spree, and have a really customized feed. So it's very rise of the algorithm stuff. But it's an interesting one in how we talk about the internet. Like when we talk about the rise of China as a threat or something like that, Huawei is a major Chinese strategic asset. It's very tied in with the state. I mean, not necessarily for nefarious reasons. If there are currently 2 like hardware of the internet companies Huawei would be the third and would give China a bit of reassurance that, you know, it wasn't just European or US companies that had the infrastructure. TikTok is a company that happens to be Chinese. And I think we've got a habit at the moment, especially amongst conservative MPs who don't really understand the internet, of acting as if Huawei and TikTok are equivalents.
Yes, yes. I don't think it was part of Beijing's 100-year plan for world domination to develop, you know, to buy a lip syncing app, which was quite big in America. Put some decent algorithms behind it, and suddenly find you with like look at the dominating team content.
Yeah, it's really, really not in the same ballpark, and yet we sort of talk about any Chinese company as if it must be equivalent to the state. It's not quite the case.
So, question from Kathleen. I think it's Caper. I'm going to can't do any pronunciations on this. She likes the idea of citizens leveraging their data, where effectively sort of what loyalty cards do in supermarkets. But as this data has been free to collect, would we need to outlaw it? I mean, what can we turn the clock back? I mean, how would you go about doing that? And I should say, I looked into this at one. You know, I was attracted to the idea like everyone else was, and I sort of looked into how you do it, and it's quite difficult. It does require quite a lot of legal and technical plumbing work.
Yes, I think it would need a lot of work on implementation, but in some ways it could be the one thing that bloody GDPR has ever been good for, in that anyone who's dealing with Europeans has had to learn how to identify PII, like personally identifiable information and stuff relating to it. And that, you know, I think that one step remove is crucial. You know, a lot of the ways our data is used is, you know, something on our browsing activity is actually matched up behind the scenes without us necessarily knowing it with our profile on a social media site or our Experian credit record.
Although I have yet to come across a social media site which has whose you may also like is in any way like reflective of my interests.
It's, I mean,
like Twitter the other week tried to convince me. Said you will also be interested in grime, rowing, and Lewis Hamilton. I was like, no.
It's I do like the idea people throw out to defend that, which is they're putting in some red herrings so that you don't worry too much. But most of my online adverts are life insurance for new parents, which you know, unless they really know something I don't. As a single gay man, I find a little bit confusing. So I don't think it's why I worry less about micro-targeting than others do. But you've got this sort of, these enrichments and this data with it. That means they can identify data and enriched data that stems from PII. That means they could be able to tag it and give you some sovereignty and some control over it again. And if you could come up with some form of register where someone can claim their ID, and then you get to state liberty issues, all sorts of other ones. But if you could do that and opt in, you then might be able to say, I universally across all websites do consent to this, don't consent to this, will only consent to this on a revenue share. You know, you could open up quite a lot of models from it.
Yeah. And then Facebook might like actually charge you if you're not going to give them their data to Facebook. They might say, well, in that case, give us like 10 quid a year or whatever.
Yeah, and they would be well within their rights to say, you are totally entitled to tick these boxes saying we can't do this and this, but that means there's a fee. And I imagine for a lot of us then we'd be going, actually, yeah, you can have that. But that's great. Then we're making an informed actual consumer choice. In a way that we can't quite now.
And a deeply cynical question from Hans Svensson. When Enigma was cracked, we basically, you know, we used it just enough to win the war without letting on to the Germans that it was there. So if someone does develop a quantum computer, what incentive do they have to actually tell anyone about it?
Absolutely none. It's also why, similarly with any hack actually, and any hacker, if they announce that they've hacked it, they're an amateur, they're an idiot, or they're trying to look like one. You know, the thing to have done with that Twitter hack that you talked about, where they seem to be able to get into some of the biggest accounts in the world, You know, they got into Elon Musk, I think they got into Joe Biden. They
Bill
didn't,
Gates.
which was probably sensible. You sit in there for weeks and weeks and weeks. You take out all the DMs, you look at all of that, but you make sure you're all in place, and you do something that's got to plummet the stock market. You know, you tell.
So the most famous example of which is obviously the Syrian one of the Syrian factions hacked into the Associated Press and tweeted breaking reports of explosions near the White House. And what I found fascinating was that, like, it wasn't even people who then responded. Automated systems within the stock market, which were scanning Twitter for news, then crashed the stock market.
Absolutely crashed it. And so, yes, if anyone broke encryption and could read everything, if they had any sense, they would say nothing. Things would start to leak. The world is not great at keeping secrets, but yes, as ever with the internet, because, you know, once a vulnerability is plugged really for one set of people, it's plugged for everyone. You know, you announce a capability, you're starting to make it, you know, get rid of it very quickly. So the smart hacks, the worst hacks are the ones you don't know about. You know, they're the ones that have pros behind them.
Oh, okay. Interesting question from final. Can you please comment on the dark web and on how algorithms like TikTok might be used to help radicalize? I mean, there's an obvious, you know, I don't think it's even algorithms like TikTok, for example. One of my favorite examples was on Twitter. If you liked UKIP on Facebook, sorry, if you I think they've fixed this now, but if you liked UKIP, which is, you know, by any standards, it is a kind of respectable party, which is, you know, well, less so towards the end, but, you know, at that point was an entirely legitimate political party with, you know, which was, you know, very firmly in the mainstream. But if you liked it, it would then say, have you thought about joining Britain First, the BNP, you know, Jews out of, you know, it was really kind of, it got very dark very quickly.
It's and of course that's not because they want to help Britain First or the BNP. It's because they look at the people who then spent the most amount of time on content are the ones who went down the kind of radicalisation rabbit hole. And so the algorithm goes, well, they kept watching loads of stuff, they must like it. And so YouTube is terrible for this. You can start by typing, what is flat Earth? And then if you keep watching and auto-playing, you'll be on sort of why flat Earth explains the QAnon conspiracy, probably within about 20 minutes. I mean, I think they've started hammering out some QAnon stuff now, but it's because the people who stay on and keep watching are the ones who are starting to believe it. And so that's the chain that it leads you down. If you just sort of look at what's flat Earth, watch 2 minutes of a video and are like, oh God, that's what they're all on about, that's really stupid, and close it, you know, they don't have the information for what you would do on autoplay next. And so it's one of those where it's not the result of a nasty algorithm going, I want this person to do the bad thing. It's just literally because the people who keep watching are the ones who would go down that path. That's what the algorithm shows you.
Yeah.
And learning,
the problem with that is
when to make them act as a circuit breaker rather than a enforcer. Yeah.
But also one of the problems with that, and I think for our democracy more generally, is that once people have gone down the rabbit hole, there's no way to reach them. So once people do believe in QAnon, once they do believe that vaccines cause MMR, once they do believe, you know, stuff which is just not true, you know, there's like that's their media consumption. You know, that they're not going to tune back into sort of mainstream.
And that's where hopefully algorithms could save us from algorithms by spotting the kind of content that is leading people into rabbit holes that then get destructive. And actually, instead of auto-playing the bad one, auto-playing them towards something that might debunk them really early, or towards content warning them about it, or something else.
But, you know, and then of course you get into it ultimately becomes political, because you could say, oh, you know, obviously QAnon and anti-vax are sort of wrong and dangerous, but you know, people's political opinions, you know, are and finally the
inevitable appearance of the cat.
But, basically, if people are watching, say, Jeremy Corbyn fan videos, and that and they may be behaving in exactly the same way as
exactly. And if you then end up accidentally censoring Jeremy Corbyn videos, you're going to have a huge political scandal of your own. Like, I mean, I don't have too much sympathy for them, but part of the problem for the internet giants is they're dealing with 2 billion people, and they have huge control on the sole control of the information diet of billions of people. And that was never really meant to happen. No one company was ever meant to have that much responsibility.
Mark Zuckerberg effectively published a thing saying, these are the terms on which I will allow the US election to happen.
Yes. And I mean, also, they have this simultaneous thing where they say, it's impossible for us to police this. But also, Mark Zuckerberg will say, 2 billion people who use my services, you will never see a woman's nipple, even in a breastfeeding shot. They will police some things incredibly stiffly, and then other things try and go, well, it's not for us to decide. And they moved fast, they broke things, but it's no surprise it's really hard for them to pick it up from here.
So we're out of time. One final question: the internet, marks out of 10.
So 6. I'll give it a 6.
Excellent. So probably better that it's there than not, but room for improvement. Wouldn't that be
exactly that? That would be I think it would have a "see me" on the report card as well.
On which note, thank you very much, James Ball. Thank you all for watching. Please do tune in again and sign up to the CPS mailing list and do all of and engage with our content and tumble algorithmically down a rabbit hole of small states, free markets, and low taxes. And also buy James's book. Thank you all very, very much.